I thought I had it all figured out. You know, 12 years with Ethan, and I genuinely believed we were building something solid together. Those first 3 years of dating were actually pretty magical. He was this brilliant mathematician who could explain complex theorems like poetry, and I was finishing up my microbiology degree, working at this pharmaceutical company where everyone treated me like I was some kind of genius. We got married when I was 26, and honestly, I felt like I was living the perfect life. Smart husband, good career, nice house in the suburbs. Everything looked exactly like it was supposed to. But here's the thing about perfect lives. They get boring as hell after a while. Ethan would come home every day at exactly 5:15, eat whatever I'd thrown together for dinner while reading some academic journal, then fall asleep by 9:30 with his reading light still on. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there thinking, is this really it? Is this what the next 40 years are going to look like? Him getting excited about differential equations while I pretend to care about his latest research project? A few years into our marriage, I started having these conversations with my Aunt Ayla. She'd been a nurse for like 20 years, and every time we talked, she had these incredible stories about saving lives and being there for people during their most vulnerable moments. She kept telling me I was wasting my talents in some sterile lab when I could be out there actually making a difference in people's lives. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. I mean, what was I doing at that pharmaceutical company? Running tests on compounds that might eventually become medications, that might eventually help someone I'd never meet. Where's the human connection in that? So I started researching nursing programs, and the more I looked into it, the more excited I got. This was real work, meaningful work, where people would actually need me and appreciate what I could do for them. When I brought it up with Ethan, I could see him trying to hide this weird expression, like he was thinking about something he didn't want to say. Finally, he admitted he was worried about the whole nurse stereotype thing, which was honestly pretty insulting, but whatever. At least he said he'd support me if it was what I really wanted. Nursing school was incredible. I mean, absolutely incredible. For the first time in years, I felt like I was somewhere I actually belonged. The professors loved me. My classmates came to me for help with everything, and during clinicals, patients would specifically ask for me. There's something amazing about being the person someone turns to when they're scared or in pain, you know? It's like you become the most important person in their world, even if it's just for a few minutes. Ethan was actually pretty great during school. He handled all the finances, made sure I had time to study, even helped me practice for exams, even though medical stuff wasn't his area at all. I thought maybe this career change would be good for both of us. Give me the fulfillment I was missing, and give him a chance to feel useful in supporting my dreams. For a while, it actually worked. When I finally started working at the hospital, everything just clicked. The other nurses respected me immediately, doctors trusted my judgment, and patients adored me. There's this rush you get when someone looks at you like you're their guardian angel, like you're the only thing standing between them, and complete despair. Ethan never understood that feeling because his work is all abstract numbers and theories. But nursing is about real human connection. The shifts were long and sometimes unpredictable, which Ethan had a hard time adjusting to at first. He's such a creature of habit that when I'd come home an hour late or have to work an extra shift to cover for someone, he'd get all anxious about his dinner schedule or whatever. But eventually he got used to it, and honestly, I think we were both happier. I was finally doing work that mattered, and he got to feel proud of having a wife who was out there saving lives. That's how things were for several years, just good, solid, normal marriage stuff. Until James. James came in after a pretty serious car accident, and from the first day there was just something different about him. Most patients are either completely focused on their pain or trying to be polite to the medical staff, but James actually saw me as a person. He'd ask about my day, remember things I'd mentioned in previous conversations, make these little jokes that showed he was actually paying attention to who I was, not just what I could do for him. I mean, I'm a professional. I've had plenty of patients who were friendly or flirtatious, and I always kept appropriate boundaries. But with James, it felt different. More genuine, I guess. Like he was interested in me as Leah, not just as his nurse. And after years of coming home to Ethan falling asleep over his math journals, having someone actually engage with me as a human being was, well, it was nice. The first real sign that things were getting complicated came when James sent me a message on his phone. It was late at night, and he claimed he was drunk on pain medication, but the message was pretty explicit. Included a photo that was definitely not appropriate for a patient to be sending his nurse. My first instinct was to report it, obviously, but then I thought about what that would mean for him. He'd probably get kicked out of the hospital, definitely get in trouble, and he was already dealing with so much pain and stress from the accident. So instead of reporting it, I sent back something supportive but firm about boundaries. I told him I understood he was going through a difficult time and that people sometimes reach out in ways they normally wouldn't, but that we needed to keep things professional. I thought that would be the end of it. But then he responded with this really heartfelt message about how embarrassed he was, how he'd never done anything like that before, but that there was just something about me that made him feel like he could be honest about his feelings. He said he was drunk when he sent the photo, but that he'd meant every word about how incredible he thought I was. And honestly, when's the last time Ethan had said anything like that to me? When's the last time anyone had? I know how this sounds. I know exactly how this sounds. But you have to understand, I wasn't looking for an affair. I wasn't some predatory nurse hunting vulnerable patients. James was the one who reached out to me, who made it clear that what he felt wasn't just gratitude or pain medication talking. And when someone opens themselves up to you like that, when they trust you with their real feelings, it would have been cruel to just shut them down completely. So I started responding to his messages. Nothing inappropriate at first, just friendly conversation that maybe went a little beyond what I'd normally have with a patient. He was smart and funny and actually interested in my thoughts about things, which was such a refreshing change from coming home to Ethan's monosyllabic responses to everything I tried to tell him about my day. The problem was that hospital messaging systems aren't exactly private, so we ended up exchanging personal phone numbers so we could talk more freely. And once we were texting on our personal phones, the conversations got more intimate, I guess. He'd tell me how much he looked forward to seeing me each day, how I was the bright spot in an otherwise miserable recovery process, how lucky Ethan was to have someone like me. I started looking forward to those messages more than I probably should have. When Ethan would fall asleep at 9:30, I'd stay up texting with James until midnight or later. When Ethan would grunt, "fine," in response to me asking about his day, I'd think about how James always wanted to hear every detail about mine. It wasn't sexual at that point, but it was definitely emotional in a way that probably crossed some lines. The first time we met, outside the hospital, it was supposedly innocent. James was being discharged, and he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime to celebrate his recovery. I told myself it was just a friendly gesture, a way to see how a former patient was doing in the real world. We met at this little cafe near the hospital, and it was honestly the most engaged conversation I'd had with anyone in months. James had this way of making everything I said seem fascinating. When I told him about some difficult case I'd handled, he'd ask follow-up questions and really listen to the answers. When I mentioned feeling underappreciated at home, he looked genuinely shocked that anyone could take someone like me for granted. By the end of that coffee date, and yes, I realize now it was definitely a date, I felt more seen and valued than I had in years. That's when I started creating the magical shifts. Look, I know how that sounds too. But the hospital schedule was already pretty chaotic, and Ethan never paid close enough attention to know exactly when I was supposed to be working versus when I was covering for other people or staying late for emergencies. When James suggested we meet for dinner after one of my real shifts, it was easy enough to tell Ethan I'd picked up an extra shift and would be home late. The dinner was incredible. We went to this little Italian place where James had made reservations, and he treated me like I was the most important person in the restaurant. He asked about my dreams, my frustrations, what I wanted out of life that I wasn't getting. When I mentioned feeling like Ethan saw me more as a roommate than a wife these days, James looked at me like that was the most tragic thing he'd ever heard. That was the night things became physical. Not sex, not yet, but definitely more than friendship. James walked me to my car and kissed me, and I kissed him back, and for the first time in years I felt like someone actually wanted me. Not wanted me to make dinner or do laundry or listen to them talk about work, but wanted me as a woman, as someone worth pursuing and cherishing. I drove home that night feeling guilty but also more alive than I had in months. Ethan was already asleep, of course, and when I slipped into bed next to him, part of me wanted to wake him up and tell him everything. But I knew he wouldn't understand. He'd just see the betrayal, not the years of emotional neglect that had led to it. After that, the extra shifts became regular. Maybe once or twice a week, I'd tell Ethan I was working late or covering for a colleague, and instead I'd meet James for dinner or drinks, or just long walks where we could talk without interruption. He made me feel beautiful and interesting and appreciated in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. The sex started about a month later. James had gotten a hotel room, said he wanted somewhere we could just be together without worrying about time or privacy. I knew crossing that line would change everything, but honestly, I was ready for everything to change. I was tired of feeling invisible in my own marriage, tired of pretending that coming home to Ethan's mathematical journals and early bedtimes was enough for me. Being with James was like remembering who I used to be before I became Ethan's wife. I was funny and sexy and spontaneous. All these parts of myself that had gotten buried under years of routine and predictability. James would text me throughout the day, telling me he couldn't wait to see me, couldn't stop thinking about our last time together, couldn't believe how lucky he was to have found me. When's the last time Ethan had made me feel lucky to be found? For several months, I honestly thought I could manage both relationships. Ethan provided stability and security, while James provided passion and appreciation. It seemed like the perfect solution to getting everything I needed without having to blow up my entire life. Ethan never seemed to notice the changes in my schedule, and when he did ask about work, I just mentioned covering extra shifts or helping out colleagues, which wasn't technically lying, since nurses do that all the time. But then Ethan started paying attention. It began with these little comments about how I seemed to be working more evening shifts than I used to, or how it was weird that the hospital needed so much extra coverage lately. I'd explain that we were short-staffed or that I was trying to help out the team, and he'd nod and seem to accept it, but I could tell something was bothering him. Then he started asking more specific questions. What time did my shift start? Who was I covering for? Why did they need coverage on a Tuesday when Tuesdays were usually slower? At first I thought he was just making conversation, but gradually I realized he was actually keeping track of my answers and noticing when they didn't quite add up. The worst part was when he'd say things like, "I thought you said you were working Thursday, but when I called the hospital they said you weren't scheduled." I'd have to scramble to explain that schedules change at the last minute, or that I was helping in a different department, or that whoever answered the phone just didn't have the updated information. And Ethan would nod like he believed me, but I could see this look in his eyes like he was filing away every inconsistency. I started feeling like I was being interrogated in my own home. Every time I mentioned work, Ethan would ask these careful, pointed questions that made it obvious he was checking my story for holes. It was exhausting and honestly pretty insulting, like I'm a grown woman with a professional career, and my husband is treating me like a teenager trying to sneak out past curfew. So when he'd question my memory about what shifts I was supposed to work, I started pushing back. I'd tell him he was misremembering, or that he hadn't been paying attention when I explained the schedule changes, or that he was getting confused about which week I was talking about, because honestly, he was being paranoid and controlling, and I wasn't going to let him make me feel guilty for working hard and being dedicated to my patients. But apparently, Ethan was keeping a calendar. I didn't find this out until much later, But while I thought I was successfully managing his suspicions, he was actually tracking every shift I claimed to work and cross-referencing it with the hospital's actual schedule. He was building a case against me like I was some kind of criminal, instead of his wife, who was just trying to find a little happiness outside of our increasingly stale marriage. The confrontation about student loans happened on a Tuesday night. I'd told Ethan I was working late to cover for a colleague, but actually I'd spent the evening with James at this wine bar he'd found. We'd talked about maybe taking a weekend trip together, somewhere we could just be a normal couple without all the sneaking around and scheduling complications. When I got home around 11, Ethan was waiting up for me, which was unusual since he's normally unconscious by 9:30. He had this serious expression and asked if we could talk about my work schedule. I figured he was going to complain about me being gone so much, so I prepared to defend myself, but instead he asked why I was picking up so many extra shifts lately. I could have told him the truth then. Part of me wanted to tell him the truth, but I also knew that the truth would destroy everything. My marriage, James's reputation, probably my career. So instead, I told him I was trying to pay off my student loans faster because some of my colleagues had been talking about debt management, and I felt embarrassed about how much I still owed. It was a good lie, believable, responsible, the kind of thing Ethan would actually approve of, and he seemed to accept it, nodding and saying he understood wanting to get out from under that debt. He even said he was proud of me for being proactive about our financial future. I went to bed that night thinking I'd successfully deflected his suspicions and bought myself more time to figure out what I wanted to do about the James situation. I was wrong. That same night, after I'd fallen asleep feeling relieved that I'd handled Ethan's questions so well, he went through my phone. I still can't believe he violated my privacy like that. 12 years of marriage, and he'd never once snooped through my personal messages. But apparently, his paranoia had reached the point where he thought that was acceptable behavior. What he found, obviously, were months of text conversations with James. Conversations that made it very clear we weren't just nurse and former patient having innocent catch-up chats. Ethan didn't say anything that night, or the next day, or the day after that. He just went about his normal routine like nothing had happened, while apparently planning his next move. I had no idea I'd been caught until that weekend, when he sat me down and said we needed to have a serious conversation. He started by saying he was giving me a chance to be honest about what I'd been doing during those extra shifts. He said if I told him the truth, that would be the only way I could possibly save our marriage. I still didn't realize he'd seen the messages, so I stuck to my story about covering for colleagues and paying down debt. I mean, what else was I supposed to do? Confess to an affair based on some vague questions? But then he said very calmly, "I know about your affair with James." The bottom just dropped out of everything. I tried to deny it at first. I didn't know what he was talking about. He was being paranoid. He was misunderstanding something he'd seen or heard. But he just sat there looking at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was watching a stranger instead of his wife. Finally, I realized there was no point in lying anymore. He obviously knew something, though I still wasn't sure how much. So I admitted that yes, I'd been spending time with James, and yes, maybe things had gotten a little complicated, but it wasn't what he thought. It was just a friendship that had maybe crossed some lines, and I was already planning to end it because I knew it wasn't appropriate. Ethan asked if I was having sex with James. I told him it wasn't about sex, that James and I had connected on an emotional level that had nothing to do with physical attraction. Which was true. Honestly, the sex was just a small part of what we meant to each other. But then Ethan said he'd seen all the messages. Everything. Every conversation, every plan we'd made, every intimate detail we'd shared. He'd been reading our private communications like they were his personal entertainment, which is such a massive violation. I still can't wrap my head around it. At that point, I figured I might as well be completely honest. I told him that yes, James and I were having an affair, but that it was a temporary thing that had happened because I was feeling neglected and unappreciated in our marriage. I explained that James had pursued me, not the other way around. and that I'd tried to maintain boundaries, but he'd been so persistent and charming that I'd eventually given in. I told Ethan it was a big mistake, something I'd gotten caught up in, but that didn't really mean anything in the long run. I said if he was willing to work on our marriage and maybe pay more attention to my needs, I'd end things with James immediately, and we could move forward. But Ethan just looked at me and said it didn't matter if it was temporary or not. The problem was that it existed in the first place. Which is such bullshit, honestly. Like, marriages go through rough patches, and sometimes people make mistakes when they're feeling lonely or undervalued. That doesn't mean you throw away 12 years together without even trying to fix things. But apparently Ethan had already made up his mind that our marriage was over, because he stood up and said he'd be staying in a hotel while he figured out next steps. I tried to explain that he was overreacting, that we could go to counseling or take a vacation together or do whatever it took to rebuild what we'd had. But he was already packing a bag, moving around our bedroom like he couldn't get out fast enough. It was like 12 years of marriage meant nothing to him compared to a few months of me finding happiness somewhere else. He left that same night, and I didn't hear from him again until his lawyer contacted my lawyer about divorce papers. Divorce papers. Like we were strangers who'd had a business deal go wrong, instead of two people who'd built a life together and taken vows to work through problems together. He didn't want to try counseling, didn't want to have any more conversations about what had happened or why, didn't even want to see if we could find our way back to each other, just straight to lawyers and paperwork and dividing up our assets like none of it had ever mattered to him. The whole divorce process was a nightmare. Ethan's lawyer made me sound like some kind of predator who'd been hunting patients at the hospital, when really I'd just developed feelings for someone who'd been pursuing me for months. They kept bringing up the professional ethics angle, like I was supposed to be some kind of robot who couldn't have normal human emotions, just because I happened to meet James in a medical setting. I asked for the house, which seemed reasonable since I'd contributed just as much to the mortgage payments as Ethan had, and I needed somewhere stable to live while I rebuilt my life. I also asked for his car, since mine was older and less reliable, and I figured he owed me that much after abandoning our marriage instead of fighting for it. The alimony thing was particularly ridiculous. Ethan's lawyer argued that since I made more money as a nurse than he did as a college math professor, I should be paying him spousal support. I pointed out that paying alimony was ridiculous, because that's traditionally a man's job. But apparently the judge didn't care about traditional gender roles. Since I had the higher income, it became my job to support my ex-husband, which is just insane. We ended up going to trial because I wasn't going to just roll over and let Ethan take everything, while I got blamed for the marriage falling apart. But the judge wasn't sympathetic at all. She kept focusing on the fact that James had been my patient, like that was the most important detail instead of the years of emotional neglect that had led me to seek connection elsewhere. In the end, I got to keep the house, but I had to refinance the mortgage and buy out Ethan's share, which put me in a much worse financial position than I'd been in during the marriage. We split the joint savings 50-50, and I had to pay Ethan a small amount of monthly alimony, though thankfully not much since his income wasn't that far below mine. We each kept our own cars, so at least I didn't have to deal with transportation issues on top of everything else. I thought that would be the end of it. Expensive, emotionally devastating, but finally over so I could move on with my life and figure out what came next. James and I had talked about maybe making our relationship official once my divorce was finalized, and I was looking forward to finally being with someone who actually appreciated me. But then I got a call from the state nursing board. Apparently, Ethan had filed a complaint against me for gross sexual misconduct related to my relationship with James. Not during the divorce proceedings, which might have helped his case, but after everything was finalized, like he'd been saving this particular piece of revenge for when it would hurt me the most, without benefiting him at all. The nursing board investigation was humiliating. They interviewed James, they interviewed my colleagues, They went through all my patient records, looking for evidence of a pattern of inappropriate behavior. They treated me like I was some predator who'd been systematically abusing vulnerable patients, instead of someone who'd developed genuine feelings for one person who happened to be receiving medical care. James tried to be supportive during the investigation, but I could tell the scrutiny was affecting him too. He started pulling back from our relationship, saying he needed space to deal with the stress of being questioned about our private interactions. By the time the nursing board reached their decision, he'd basically disappeared from my life entirely. The board voted to permanently revoke my nursing license for gross sexual misconduct. Permanently. Like I could never be trusted around patients again. Like I was some kind of dangerous predator instead of someone who'd made one mistake with one person who'd been actively pursuing me. Suddenly, I was unemployed with a mortgage I could barely afford on my own. No way to work in the only field I'd trained for in the past decade, and an ex-husband who'd systematically destroyed my entire life because his ego couldn't handle the fact that someone else had found me attractive. I sent Ethan some messages letting him know exactly what I thought of his vindictive bullshit. I told him he'd destroyed my career over a temporary mistake, that he'd ruined my entire future because he was too much of a coward to fight for our marriage, like a real man would have. I might have mentioned that I knew where he was living now, and that he was going to pay for what he'd done to me. Apparently, those messages were threatening, because now his lawyer is talking about getting a protective order. Like I'm some dangerous criminal instead of his ex-wife who's understandably angry about having her entire life destroyed over a few months of finding happiness in someone who actually cared about her. So here I am, divorced, unemployed, facing foreclosure on the house I fought so hard to keep, and potentially facing legal consequences for expressing my anger about the situation. All because I made the mistake of thinking I deserved to feel appreciated and desired by someone who actually saw me as more than just a convenient roommate. Everyone acts like I'm the villain in this story, but I'm the one who lost everything. Ethan gets to keep his job and his reputation and move on with his life, like our 12 years together never happened. James gets to disappear back to his normal life without any professional consequences at all, and I'm the one paying the price for everyone else's choices and actions. I know how this sounds. I know everyone will say I brought this on myself, that I should have ended my marriage before starting something with James, that I violated professional ethics and deserve to lose my license. But the truth is, I was just a woman trying to find some happiness and connection in a life that had become routine and emotionally empty. I didn't set out to hurt anyone or destroy anything. I just wanted to feel valued and appreciated by someone who saw me as more than just a function they needed performed. Maybe that was selfish. Maybe I should have handled things differently. But I don't think I deserve to lose absolutely everything because I made some imperfect choices during a difficult time in my marriage. I don't think wanting to feel loved and desired makes me a monster who can never be trusted around patients again. But apparently, that's exactly what everyone thinks I am.